To Washington, D.C. to sit on the Foreign Relations Committee today as we hear from both Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel about the administration's plans to intervene militarily in Syria. I return to Washington still as a skeptic of military intervention in Syria. I've been one of the leading voices in the Senate against military strikes, and though I will let the administration make its case after these chemical weapons attacks, I'm going to have to be convinced that this makes sense for the American people. I heard loud and clear from people across Connecticut this weekend that this state is pretty weary of war, and they need to be convinced as well by this president this week that there is a direct national security interest in striking Syria, and that this won't escalate into something that will cost us potentially billions in dollars and equal amounts commensurate in reputation around the world. I'm going to go into this week with an open mind. I spoke with the president this weekend and told him that I was going to need to be convinced, but I would let him and his administration make the case. My concerns are largely twofold. First, I still don't believe that a military strike is going to make the situation better for the Syrian people. It frankly may make it worse. Assad will respond, whether or not it's with future chemical weapons strikes. In the short run, if we are only engaging in a short-term targeted military strike, it doesn't solve the underlying problem for the Syrian people, that they are living under a murderous regime, whether or not he uses chemical weapons. Second, I think that this conflict could spiral out of control and drag the United States into something that is much beyond just one targeted missile strike. The president told me this weekend that he firmly believes that we can keep this strike limited and that this will not involve a long-term U.S. commitment. But I remain doubtful that this does not escalate in the region and doesn't commit the United States, if not with ground forces, with substantial air forces and support for our allies in the long run. So I will give the administration the time this week to make their case, but I certainly enter the week as a skeptic of U.S. military intervention.
Would you feel differently if other countries made the commitment and were prepared to take action?
I would feel better if there was more of an international consensus, but I'm also a realist. I know there are going to be times at which there is a U.S. national security interest that does not align with other nations. And so the bar for me in terms of what it takes to intervene militarily around the world is not necessarily that we have international consensus. It's that what we are proposing to do actually will make a difference. And in this case, with or without international participation in this military strike, I'm just not sure this is going to make a difference for the Syrian people in the short run or make a difference in a positive direction for American national security in the long run.
Could you vote for the resolution as drafted by the White House, or would it need to be changed to get your vote?
The resolution that the White House submitted to Congress is a non-starter, as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't have any of the limitations that the president has talked about publicly, such as a restriction against the usage of ground forces. And so right now, the Foreign Relations Committee, upon which I sit, is working to redraft that resolution. And I think everyone understands that the only way that that resolution passes the Senate and certainly the House is if there is much more limitation built into the president's authority.
When do you expect a vote on that?
I expect to vote early next week. I think we're going to take this week on the Foreign Relations Committee to hear from the administration. Members are returning to Washington right now to receive the classified briefings, but the President and Secretary Kerry have made it very clear that they need a vote by early next week, and I expect that we'll be able to accommodate them.
Is there any alternative other than a military strike to help innocent people who have been gassed? Are any countries talking about perhaps asylum? Could something like that work?
Well, the president himself has made it very clear that there is no military solution to the problems in Syria, that there is only a political and diplomatic solution. My worry is that a military strike could exacerbate our diplomatic efforts, not help them. Ultimately, it's the Russians that are going to have to step in here and tell the brutal dictator that they are protecting that enough is enough, that he has to stop these attacks and that he has to go. these strikes may put Russia's back up against the wall and may make it even harder for us to work with them to try to bring an end to this conflict. Certainly, there's more that we can do from a humanitarian perspective.
What are the shortcomings in the argument that a line must be established now, a message sent to North Korea, a message sent to states like Iran? Well, why do you find that unpersuasive so far?
If there is an argument to me that it's persuasive, it's that we do need to send a message to the international community that this behavior is unacceptable. I am skeptical of the utility of these attacks in terms of changing the reality on the ground in Syria, but I certainly do understand the president's argument that as we potentially go into a future conflict with Iran, we want to send a message to them and to others that your pursuit and potential usage of weapons of mass destruction is unacceptable. So I will admit that that part of the argument is persuasive to me, that we need, as the one remaining world superpower, to uphold international norms. And we need to send a message to people like the North Koreans and the Iranians that we won't accept this kind of behavior. So I'm going to listen to that argument this week. I don't know, though, that that argument is enough to overcome my objections.
Are there viable alternatives to a strike to send that message?
Well, ultimately, we want Assad to stop attacks on his people, whether it's chemical weapons attacks or conventional weapons attacks, and that's only going to happen through diplomatic means. So I think there is limited utility to a military strike. And I guess let me back up for a second. We need to have a sober conversation in Washington this week about the limits of American power. There are some times when there are awful things happening around the world, and the United States can't change that reality. Now, people that I talk to in Connecticut are absolutely horrified at what they have seen on TV with respect to these chemical weapons attacks. But they wonder whether the United States can really make a difference here. And I know that it's really terrible to think that these bad things are happening around the world, and the United States, the most powerful country in the world, may not be able to make a difference. But we have suffered from an abundance of hubris, especially in the Middle East over the last 10 years. And we just have to understand that there are times in which our actions may not make the situation better or potentially make the situation worse, and this may be one of them.